Picture this. Africa sits atop more proven oil and gas reserves than most of the Middle East combined. We're talking about Nigeria's 37 billion barrels, Angola's 13 billion, Algeria's vast natural gas deposits, and Libya's untapped potential. Yet somehow, despite controlling these astronomical resources, hundreds of millions of Africans still lack reliable electricity, clean water, and economic opportunity. How is this possible? How does a continent blessed with such extraordinary wealth remain systematically impoverished? The answer lies in one of the most sophisticated economic extraction schemes in modern history, a system so deeply entrenched that most people don't even recognize it as theft. Today, we're exposing the untold story of Africa's oil and gas wealth, and more importantly, how a new generation of African leaders is finally breaking these chains. But before we dive deep into this economic revolution, let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard mainstream media celebrate an African nation taking control of its own resources? When have you seen Western outlets praise African leaders who dare to renegotiate contracts that favor their people over foreign shareholders? The silence is deafening, and it's intentional. Let's establish the facts that international media conveniently ignores. Nigeria alone produces over 2 million barrels of oil daily. Angola pumps out 1.3 million barrels. Algeria possesses the 10th largest natural gas reserves globally. Libya, despite years of manufactured instability, holds Africa's largest proven oil reserves. Combined, these four nations control more hydrocarbon wealth than Norway, Canada, and Venezuela put together. Yet here's where the story becomes truly shocking. Despite generating hundreds of billions in oil revenue annually, Nigeria imports 90% of its refined petroleum products. Angola, the second largest oil producer in Africa, relies almost entirely on fuel imports to meet domestic demand. Algeria exports massive quantities of natural gas to Europe, while its own citizens face energy shortages during winter months. This isn't incompetence, it's by design. For over 60 years, Western oil conglomerates have maintained a stranglehold on African energy infrastructure, ensuring that raw materials flow out while refined products flow back in at premium prices. It's perhaps the most elegant form of economic colonialism ever devised. Total, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron. These aren't just oil companies operating in Africa. They are the architects of a system that transforms African natural wealth into European and American prosperity. Through a complex web of production sharing agreements, joint ventures, and long-term contracts negotiated during the immediate post-independence era, these corporations secured terms that would make medieval feudal lords envious. Consider the mathematics of extraction. When Nigerian crude sells for $80 per barrel on international markets, Nigeria typically receives between $15 to $25 after production costs, transportation, refining, and corporate profits are deducted. The remaining $55 to $65 per barrel flows directly into Western corporate coffers and government treasuries through taxes and royalties. But the exploitation extends far beyond simple profit margins. Western oil companies deliberately discouraged downstream investment throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They convinced African governments that refining was too complex, too expensive, too risky for developing nations. Instead, they promoted the narrative that Africa should focus on what it does best, extracting raw materials while leaving value addition to more technologically advanced nations. This wasn't economic advice. It was economic warfare disguised as development strategy. To understand the current transformation, we must examine how this system evolved. During the independence movements of the 1960s, departing colonial powers faced a dilemma. They could no longer maintain direct political control, but they desperately needed continued access to African resources to fuel their post-war economic boom. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity: grant political independence while maintaining economic dependence. They achieved this through a combination of debt structures, technical assistance agreements, and resource contracts that essentially recreated colonial extraction under the guise of partnership. For decades, this system functioned flawlessly. African leaders who challenged these arrangements faced immediate consequences: economic sanctions, political isolation, or in extreme cases, regime change. The message was clear: you can have your flag and your national anthem, but the resources belong to us. However, something fundamental has shifted in recent years. A new generation of African leaders has emerged. Leaders who weren't raised during the colonial era, who studied the global economy, who understand exactly how this extraction system operates. These leaders possess something their predecessors often lacked: the confidence to say no. Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso represents this new paradigm perfectly. At just 34 years old, he embodies a generation that views sovereignty not as a privilege to be granted by former colonial powers, but as an inherent right to be exercised. When Traoré speaks about Burkina Faso's natural resources, he doesn't seek permission or validation from Paris or Washington. He simply states facts. These resources belong to Burkina Faso, and they will be developed for the benefit of Burkina Faso's people. This isn't radicalism, it's common sense. Yet watch how Western media responds to such statements. They immediately invoke the specter of instability, corruption, or authoritarianism. Why? Because the mere suggestion that Africans can manage their own resources threatens a trillion-dollar extraction economy. Now let's discuss the game-changing developments that mainstream media either ignores or deliberately misrepresents. Across Africa, we're witnessing an unprecedented wave of energy infrastructure investment, not funded by Western development loans, but by African governments using their own resources. Nigeria's Dangote Refinery represents perhaps the most significant challenge to the extraction system since independence. With a capacity of 650,000 barrels per day, this facility can process more oil than many entire countries consume. When fully operational, it will not only end Nigeria's dependence on imported fuel, but position the country as a major refined product exporter to West Africa. But here's what makes this development truly revolutionary. It was built with Nigerian capital, employs Nigerian workers, and will be managed by Nigerian professionals. No World Bank loans with structural adjustment conditions, no IMF debt that could be weaponized for political leverage. Pure African self-determination in action. The ripple effects extend far beyond Nigeria. Ghana is developing its own refining capacity. Angola has launched ambitious downstream projects. Even smaller nations like Chad and Equatorial Guinea are investing in processing facilities rather than simply exporting crude. This infrastructure revolution serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it captures value addition domestically, transforming low-margin crude exports into high-margin refined products. Second, it creates thousands of skilled jobs that cannot be outsourced. Third, it reduces vulnerability to external supply disruptions. Fourth, and most importantly, it demonstrates to the world that Africans possess the technical competence to manage complex industrial processes. Perhaps the most underestimated element in this transformation is Africa's demographic advantage. With a median age of just 19.7 years, Africa possesses the world's youngest population. This isn't just a statistic, it's a strategic asset that fundamentally alters the sovereignty equation. Young Africans today have access to global information networks that previous generations couldn't imagine. They can instantly compare living standards in oil-rich nations like Norway or Kuwait with conditions in oil-rich African countries. They understand that there's no natural law requiring resource abundance to coexist with widespread poverty. More crucially, this generation doesn't carry the psychological burden of colonialism that sometimes constrained their parents and grandparents. They don't automatically assume that Western expertise is superior or that African capabilities are inherently limited. When they see successful infrastructure projects in China, South Korea, or Singapore, they ask a simple question: why not here? This generational shift creates profound political pressure on African leaders. Youth-driven protests in countries like Chad, Gabon, and Niger increasingly focus on resource governance, rather than traditional political grievances. Young people are demanding transparency about oil revenues, accountability for development spending, and local participation in energy projects. Ibrahim Traoré's popularity among African youth stems partly from his age, but more importantly, from his willingness to articulate their frustrations with the existing system. When he speaks about African self-reliance, he's channeling sentiments shared by millions of young Africans who refuse to accept that their continent should remain a source of raw materials for others. One of the most insidious aspects of the extraction system is how it's defended through media manipulation. Western outlets consistently portray African resource nationalism as dangerous, unstable, or economically irrational. They create false dichotomies: either accept Western management of your resources or face chaos and poverty. This narrative serves a specific purpose. It conditions both African and international audiences to view sovereignty as risky rather than natural. When an African leader announces plans to renegotiate resource contracts, media coverage immediately focuses on potential investor flight, economic uncertainty, or political instability. When the same contracts generate billions for Western companies while leaving African communities in poverty, that's simply market dynamics. Consider how media covered the recent developments in Niger. When Niger's new leadership demanded better terms for uranium mining, uranium that powers French nuclear plants, while Niger remains one of the world's poorest countries, Western outlets immediately framed this as anti-Western sentiment or Russian influence. They couldn't conceive that Nigerians might simply want fair compensation for their own resources. The same pattern repeats across the continent. When Mali reconsidered its mining contracts, it was portrayed as political instability rather than economic sovereignty. When Burkina Faso demanded greater local participation in gold mining, it was framed as investor hostility rather than resource nationalism. This media bias isn't accidental, it's strategic. By consistently portraying African resource nationalism as dangerous or irrational, Western media helps maintain an environment where extraction contracts heavily favor foreign companies. A most promising aspect of Africa's resource revolution is its increasingly regional character. Individual countries are no longer fighting these battles in isolation. Instead, we're seeing coordinated approaches that leverage collective bargaining power. The African Continental Free Trade Area creates unprecedented opportunities for resource-rich nations to collaborate on downstream development. Rather than competing to export crude oil to the same Western refineries, African nations can now coordinate refining capacity, share technical expertise, and develop integrated supply chains. Nigeria's refining capacity doesn't just benefit Nigeria. It provides energy security for the entire West African region. Angola's downstream investments complement, rather than compete with similar projects in neighboring countries. This regional approach multiplies the impact of individual sovereignty initiatives. Moreover, coordination helps African nations resist the divide-and-conquer tactics that historically undermined resource nationalism. When Western oil companies face resistance in one country, they typically shift operations to more compliant neighbors, using economic pressure to punish sovereignty initiatives. Regional coordination neutralizes this strategy. We're also seeing knowledge transfer between African countries that bypasses traditional Western gatekeepers. Algerian expertise in natural gas processing is flowing to other African nations. Nigerian refining technology is being adapted for smaller markets. South African mining techniques are being applied across the continent. Let's examine the economic mathematics that mainstream analysis consistently ignores. Africa currently exports approximately 8 million barrels of crude oil daily at an average price of $75 per barrel. That represents $600 million in daily export value, or roughly $220 billion annually. However, because most of this crude is exported for processing elsewhere, Africa captures only the wellhead value, typically 20 to 30% of the final product value. The remaining 70 to 80% flows to countries that add value through refining, transportation, and marketing. If Africa refined just half of its current crude production domestically, it would capture an additional $80 to $100 billion annually in value-added revenue. That's more than the total GDP of countries like Morocco or Ethiopia. It's enough to transform infrastructure, education, healthcare, and living standards across the continent. But the benefits extend beyond simple revenue calculations. Domestic refining creates multiplier effects throughout the economy. Each refinery job supports multiple additional positions in transportation, maintenance, security, and administration. Refined product availability reduces input costs for other industries, making African manufacturing more competitive globally. Perhaps most importantly, domestic refining reduces African vulnerability to external supply shocks. Currently, political tensions between Western nations and oil exporters can create fuel shortages in African countries that have no involvement in the underlying conflicts. Domestic refining capacity provides energy security that no number of foreign reserves can match. While celebrating these developments, we must also acknowledge the significant challenges that remain. Building world-class refining capacity requires enormous capital investment, sophisticated technical expertise, and complex logistics coordination. Not every African nation possesses the immediate capability to develop such facilities independently. Additionally, Western oil companies and their government allies aren't passively accepting these changes. They're deploying every tool available: economic pressure, political interference, media campaigns to maintain their advantageous position. African nations pursuing resource sovereignty must prepare for sustained pushback. Corruption remains a legitimate concern in some countries. Infrastructure investments can be undermined by leaders who prioritize personal enrichment over national development. However, this challenge is often exaggerated by external observers who seem to assume that corruption is uniquely African rather than a global phenomenon requiring institutional solutions. The key is distinguishing between leaders who genuinely serve their people's interests and those who merely use sovereignty rhetoric to justify personal power grabs. True sovereignty movements are characterized by transparency, accountability, and measurable improvements in citizens' lives. As we look toward the future, Africa's oil and gas revolution represents just the beginning of a broader resource sovereignty movement. Niger's uranium situation perfectly illustrates the next phase of this transformation. Niger produces uranium that powers 40% of French nuclear energy, yet Niger itself has one of the world's lowest electrification rates. This arrangement, exporting energy resources while lacking domestic energy access, epitomizes the extraction system that's being challenged across the continent. When African leaders demand fairer terms for uranium, lithium, cobalt, and other critical minerals, they're applying lessons learned from the oil and gas sector. They're refusing to accept that resource abundance should coexist with domestic poverty. A global energy transition actually strengthens Africa's bargaining position. As the world shifts toward renewable energy and electric vehicles, demand for African minerals will intensify. Unlike the oil era, when alternative suppliers existed, many critical minerals are predominantly found in Africa. This geographic concentration provides leverage that previous generations of African leaders never possessed. The transformation we're witnessing represents more than economic policy. It's the emergence of genuine African agency on the global stage. For too long, Africa has been portrayed as a passive recipient of aid, investment, or expertise from others. The resource sovereignty movement demonstrates that Africa possesses the wisdom, capability, and determination to chart its own course. Ibrahim Traoré and leaders like him aren't seeking permission to develop their country's resources. They're simply exercising the sovereignty that should never have been questioned. When Western observers express concern about these developments, they're revealing their own assumptions about African capabilities rather than identifying genuine problems. The oil story represents Africa's economic liberation in real time. Every refinery built, every pipeline constructed, every processing facility that comes online challenges decades of imposed dependency. More importantly, each success demonstrates to other African nations that alternatives to extraction exist. This is why your engagement with content like these matters more than you might realize. Every view, every like, every share sends a signal to algorithm systems that African perspectives deserve global attention. Every subscription to channels that center African agency helps counterbalance media narratives that consistently marginalize African voices. The mainstream media won't tell these stories because they threaten established interests. Social media algorithms often suppress content that challenges Western economic dominance. That's why your active participation becomes a form of resistance against information colonialism. So here's what I need you to do. If this analysis resonates with you, hit that like button right now. Your engagement helps this content reach other people who need to understand these dynamics. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming deep dive into Niger's uranium battle, a story that could reshape global energy politics. More importantly, share this video with friends, family members, and colleagues who still believe that Africa's poverty is somehow natural or inevitable. Help them understand that resource abundance and widespread poverty aren't compatible unless extraction systems are deliberately designed to maintain that contradiction. The African Renaissance isn't coming, it's already here. The question is whether you'll be part of the audience that witnesses this transformation, or an active participant in supporting African sovereignty movements through your engagement and attention. Comment below with your thoughts on Africa's resource revolution. Which country's energy developments are you most excited to follow? What questions do you have about the economics of sovereignty that we should address in future videos? Remember, every action you take on this platform either supports authentic African voices or allows them to be marginalized by algorithms designed to maintain existing power structures. Choose consciously. Engage deliberately. Subscribe immediately. The revolution will not be televised by mainstream media, but it will be documented, analyzed, and celebrated here. Don't miss it. Your continent is finally taking control of its destiny, and this is just the beginning of that extraordinary story.